Hey, everybody, welcome back to the ProgCast. I'm Gregg Bendian, and I'm also welcoming back one of my favorite musicians and someone who I've been listening to since I was a wee lad, and just a big fan, big admirer of his work. He is one of the progenitors of progressive rock music as we know it, a member of Genesis, GTR, and of course, all of his tremendous solo output. Welcome back to the ProgCast, Steve Hackett. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Greg. How are you?
I'm okay. Thanks again for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.
You've got a bunch of cool stuff coming up, and I thought we could jump off talking about that a little bit.
Sure.
You have recently been touring, performing the music from Foxtrot by Genesis, the 50th
Yeah,
anniversary.
that's right. Yeah. Foxtrot was 1972. In order to fulfill the commitments of touring that album live, I've been on a kind of permanent catch-up since the pandemic. One of the shows I was due to do with an orchestra was deferred for 3 years. People bought tickets all that time ago, and so that's why, in answer to the question, why are you doing a centenary of that album, which stretches into not just this year, but into the following year? But yeah, as I say, fulfilling commitments that were meant to be signed, sealed, and delivered 2 or 3 years ago. That's what's going on now. So that's part of it. But I've been touring it in Europe extensively. Europe, Scandinavia, various parts of the world. It's kept me very, very busy, both the Genesis stuff and the other stuff, the other more recent stuff and the solo stuff and various things, working with loads of people in different situations. But the band are as glorious as ever. I'm a big fan of the guys that I work with. They do great work with me. They do great work on their own, great work with other people. They're extraordinary players. So I know that there was this idea with Genesis that in the early days, albums like Foxtrot, people would listen to the album and then they'd see us live and they'd say, you guys are much better live than you are on record. And one tries to address that. So there's a live version from Brighton, England, on the coast, mixed by Chris Lord-Alge, so American producer, mixing work originally written by Genesis 50 years plus ago, but it sounds fresh as ever, done by this guy. It's a extraordinary mix. It sounds absolutely wonderful. I'm thrilled with it.
Well, there's a timeless quality to that music. I know that touring, playing that music with the musical box, as I did for a number of years, it just always felt very organic and as if it was just unfolding in real time. I'm very curious, now that you've gone back and taken another look at the music from Foxtrot, which for many people is kind of when the band starts to step up into its more mature period after Nursery Crime. How do you feel looking back at that group of songs, which we now consider to be classic prog?
Well, I think it's rhythmically sophisticated. It's certainly complicated and syncopated and all those adjectives, but there's still a sort of simplicity of intent that runs through it. And that's something that I look for when I hear, some of the most complicated classical things. Listening to Bach with all that masses of technique being displayed, there still seems to be an intention through all of the convolutions and all of the things that are so difficult to get your fingers around. And I suspect that the appeal of Genesis is somewhat the same. I'm not saying that we're on a par with that, but I'm saying that music that's detailed delivers because the devil is in that detail. That's the whole point. And with a lot of modern music that I hear that bypasses a lot of the processes, I realized that when you've got modern stuff being made with perhaps one singer and one programmer, no musicians, to some extent, that's all you need to have a hit record. But I think if you're scoring a movie or if you're hoping to be the next Beethoven, I don't think you can get away with that. I think that there has to be something that engages musicians. In other words, I know that might sound elitist, but at the same time, what is it that drives people to want to learn to play musical instruments? That can be a self-taught process, as it is in my case, or perhaps you can go the classical route. Usually pianists follow that. I don't know too many self-taught keyboard men. It seems to go with the territory, but nonetheless, there's this reverence and the need to explore what people have done in the past. Why have they done that? Why does something work with orchestra? Why does Bach's work come across on a Cassiotone and at the same time the Berlin Philharmonic? It seems to be indifferent to the instruments that are playing it. But somehow something that's through composed and really felt by the musician, I think, has got a chance of influencing people and lasting a lot longer. That's the intention anyway. At the end of the day, if any of this stuff survives, and I'm thrilled that it survived as long as it has done, if it lives on beyond my lifetime, then I think job done. Then lots of musical collisions that work. There's a section in Can Utility and the Coastliners, which is a song that we didn't really perform with Genesis, but now I get to perform it as part of doing the album in total, where although I wrote the song part and the lyric, actually the most interesting part I find is when the band starts to jam on two chords, and then Tony starts to do his work, his sort of harmonic wonder with a mellotron string melody that sounds like it's from arguably Prokofiev or any classical composer. It's certainly worthy of that. Phil is doing jazz drumming. The guitarists are just hitting a couple of chords, but there's rhythm there. And there's three different worlds going on. There's folk, there's jazz approach, there's classical approach, all working together. Perhaps the most successful collision of disparate styles and schools that I've ever heard. And it's only a short section. It's over in a minute, I think, at most.
Well, Can Utility is an interesting piece because many of us who've done some deep search on Genesis know that it started out as a Bye Bye Johnny. Is that right?
I think that was a joke that Pete used to use. He might have used that when things used to break down, which they did regularly back in the old days. Bye Bye Johnny. It's entirely possible. Maybe it's because it came from the guitarist's pen. Bye Bye Johnny, guitarists, Bye Bye Stevie in that case.
Yeah. And you were the one that brought the seeds of Can Utility to the band?
Yeah. That was the intention. The intention was to write something which was, even at that early stage, in a style that was typical of Genesis, and I was trying to produce something, if not to order, then certainly in the style of, so that it would be supported by a couple of 12 strings, and as we did, multiple chiming instruments, which was part of the appeal of the early band. But then it got to be taken places that were perhaps unexpected. I remember, funnily enough, I used to go to the Marquee Club in London when it was in Wardour Street, and Charisma offices were just above. And I used to go in there because it was a little bit like our local watering hole. You know, it couldn't be closer. And so they used to let me in. I didn't have to pay on the door. And there was a German guy called Uli who was on the door, and they'd be playing music, and he'd be playing in his little kiosk. And I heard strains of that, and I didn't recognize what it was. It's always lovely when this happens. And I said, "Oh, who's that?" And he said, "You're joking. That's you guys." And I thought, job done. I've heard music. I didn't know who did it. And I'm thrilled to find out it was actually us or me. And I've had that happen a few times since, like on one of the cruises on the Blue, there was some orchestral stuff. And I said, "Oh, it sounds really lovely." And my wife turned to me, Joe said, "That's you. But if you don't catch the first note, that's the best thing." And you just hear a tail end of melody. And it's not that I'm getting older. I've always am losing memory, but this is something that's always happened with me. I don't necessarily recognize something that I've done, certainly not at a distance. But it's always nice when you hear something and you think, "Oh, that sounds good," only to find out later you've been involved with it. There's no greater payoff other than John Lennon saying that he considered Genesis to be true sons of the Beatles at one point. So he's on record saying that on a recorded interview. And again, praise doesn't come from any higher quarter than that. So
yeah, it's interesting.
This stuff is worth preserving.
And also the kind of strategy that had started out in nursery crime or even earlier of the scale of intensity. So going from very delicate acoustic to really intense electric, right?
Yes, I think most loud Genesis tunes tended to start off quiet to start off with. Not too many that go bam from the word go. There's usually a bit of meandering and then whammo. I used the same thing myself when we were doing Camino Royale with Nick Magnus. He had some chords at the beginning, and then the band kick in, and then there's an accent as well. So that idea of syncopated music, but something that's very loud very quickly, but not necessarily right at the beginning. So its nearest relation would be Dance on a Volcano. But one day I'll get to do it with an orchestra, so that you get to hear the full power of that first loud chord. That's it. The thing. So a syncopation and big things that come in on an accent. I mean, great. Love all that sort of stuff. The element of surprise is there, of course, first time you hear something like that live, and that's really what it's all about. It's a shame that anyone ever has to get to really know a piece of music. It's like me hearing I'm the Walrus for the first time on a little mono radio and thinking, yeah, truly interesting. Who the hell was that? Only to be told by the DJ that was the Beatles.
So that's an interesting period for you musically, because we get Horizons out of that period. We get all great stuff with the multiple 12 strings on Summer's Ready. And I think that it seems to me like there are things that come out of that, particularly like Apocalypse and 9/8, that are jams. Would that be fair?
Yes. Yes, I think that album, Foxtrot, is probably the band at its broadest in terms of influence. There's Horizons on one level, influenced by music from the 1500s and the 16 and 1700s. And then right at the beginning of the album, in other words, two sides that begin with completely contrasting music, you've got something which was an attempt to do a sci-fi film, but in music with Water of the Skies. No one's used it in a movie as far as I know. Maybe it's been used in documentaries, but it's with the re-records that I've been involved with that. It's sometimes been with an orchestra, it's sometimes been in surround 5-1. Nobody, I'm aware that there hasn't been an Atmos mix of it yet, but the sound of the mellotron that I was particularly concerned with, very picky about what the sound of the mellotron sounds like. That's all been part and parcel of it. So these days we sometimes use the mellotron strings, the brass, the English accordion that underpins the thing as a bass instrument. Sometimes Roger King will add to that with modern samples. Other times he strips it right back and says, yeah, I thought that maybe the character of it initially was best. We smooth off the strings a little bit so that they're not too nasty, but I'm sure you'll be familiar with the sound of that mellotron strings going at you.
Of course. And Roger King has been such a long time musical partner of yours and still at it.
He has, yeah. I mean, I've been touring in South America the past few weeks and came back really tired, of course. A thrilling tour, but absolutely shattered just from the flights alone. And I said to him, oh yeah, my understanding is we're recording tomorrow. And he said, yes. So Thursday we start recording again to finish off an album. And I said, it's been so busy. I'm coming in for a rest by comparison. He said to me, yeah, that might be a rest for you, but not for me. But he'll be working the knobs. He'll be trying to bring my dreams into reality. So it's part of the price of admission. But there we are. It's his very dry sense of humor and my endless demands for questing for perfection and adventure and everything. I think I learned very early on that you never really get what you really wanted unless you were very, I wouldn't use the word demanding, but focused on what you want. That's the whole point. You listen back to something and think, why isn't it working? Perhaps if I just change this, perhaps the snare drum just needs a little bit more effect on it, or a bit more ambience, or a bit more bottom on it even, that sort of thing. Sometimes it's fatal doing things with samples, because a sample might give you something that the human can't do, but the human will give it the feel and the choreography, for lack of a better word, the extreme amount of detail that usually you won't get out of programming unless you're a drummer yourself in the first place, of course. There's always that. But then sometimes the combination of man and machine. This, of course, will be heresy for any drummers listening to what I'm saying. God's given drums don't need any messing about. And indeed, depends how they're recorded. Depends who's doing it. Depends on the room. Depends on the ambience. Depends on all sorts of bloody things that we can't do. We have to hand it over at some point, unless you're a master at either programming or drumming yourself, of course.
So who's rounding out the current band, Steve?
Current band, same as my touring band, Roger King, first and foremost. Rob Townsend on brass, woodwind, multi-instrumentalist, keyboard, percussion, his department. And on vocals, Nad Sylvan of Swedish-American extraction. Jonas Reingold, the other Swede in the band, currently residing in Austria. Incredible musician. They're all incredible in their own way. Craig Blundell on drums. Many drummers' hero is Craig. Few hit them as fast and furiously and as solidly as he does. He's got a very loud a very loud sound. I think he uses this recoil technique that produces a really loud sound. This is a noise that drummers didn't used to make some years ago. I think perhaps the only other drummer that I've heard hitting him that hard would be Marco Minimum. I'm told by both those guys that it's this kind of recoil technique. So you're hitting it, but then there's the snatch that goes with it. I just don't know how the hell they do it. It's the opposite to a soggy sound. It's incredibly crisp, and it hits you like a steel girder. It's an incredible thing. The combination of him and Jonas together, it's a mighty rhythm section to be. It's Battleship Destroyer coming at you. It's incredible stuff, just from the rhythm department alone.
Well, the heavier elements of Genesis always struck me as proto-metal. If you think about like the end of Hogweed, it's just such an attack.
Well, yeah, I think you're right. I mean, Tony was doing Mellotron brass, and I thought the only thing to compete with that was power chords, 2 notes, bass notes, and I was doing that through one of the fuzz boxes I used to use. Can't remember if it was the Duo fuzz or whether it was the Color Sound, but and of course it all ended up sounding like pure brass, because by the time you've got organ, brass, I think he was using organ as well, and power chord, it all meshes into one. I've recorded it since in recent years on Genesis Revisited #2, the second volume of the nostalgic revisit that I insist on doing from time to time on record, and Neil Morse on vocal on that, taken a little bit faster than the original, and I think it's also got prototype tapping on the front. All of that. I think it was Mike Portnoy with Transatlantic. I heard them playing it at a faster speed and joined them on stage at a festival here in London and relearned the tune. And I thought, actually, you know what? When it's delivered with this kind of, it's almost as if it was the same song but performed on cocaine. It's just gone up a little bit faster. The heartbeat is going a little bit dangerously fast, and but it helps to what was it? He said, yeah, you know, maybe gives a little bit of extra speed to the old warhorse, you know.
And this year, Steve, is also next month the 50th anniversary of the release of Selling England by the Pound by Genesis.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. I was out there doing that album 2 or 3 years ago, pre-COVID, just because it seemed like a great idea to do a Grand Slam thing, to do the whole of Selling England and most of Spectral Mornings, to give people a show of perhaps their favorite aspects of things I've been involved with over the years. And so strictly speaking, yes, if I was doing the pure centenary thing, which I think a number of the tribute bands are doing, it'll be right for either this year for that one, and then 74, I think 74 translated to 2024, I'll do some Lamb highlights. If not, I don't think I'll be doing the whole thing, so I'll leave that to tribute bands should they wish to undertake the whole shebang. Go for it. We in Genesis tended to feel that the album, perhaps, if you whittled it down to your own personal favorites, you could have a very strong single album. The album got to stretch out into lots of atmospherics and bridge passages and various other things, none of which are bad within themselves and have been influential, I like to think, because it is so long ago. But there's some lovely moments on it, extraordinary things. But I think, Undertaken as a whole is very kind of lead singer dependent and dependent on theatrics and all the rest. I think just to do it straight perhaps doesn't deliver in quite the way that the original did or was supposed to do. Of course, anyone with an endless budget and an upgrade could be doing what we as Genesis threatened to do in 2005, which was reconvene the team that first got together in 71. But it was not to be. Too many people were pulling in too many different directions. Some wanted to do it as a musical. Some didn't think it was suitable for that it would be too complicated as a musical. We'll never know, because the power of veto remains with each individual member.
So the 50th anniversary of things, there's so many this year. Birds of Fire by Mahavishnu Orchestra was
wonderful. Yeah.
So was Mahavishnu something that you guys were checking out around that time?
I think so. I think Mahavishnu was on the turntable. I know that Phil was very keen on that. I think that to some extent the direction that Brand X were to head in was, somewhat based on the idea of the fire and fury of that. And I think that you have to look back over the course of history. You get to see the effect of free jazz on what we now consider to be prog. Prog is a catch-all term for something that we weren't really aware that we were doing. There was a certain amount of the influence of jazz. John Coltrane, the influence of John Coltrane upon King Crimson, the influence of King Crimson on what you could say on Mahavishnu, the influence of Mahavishnu on King Crimson. These things are all, if they're not documented, they're all up there in the the whispering gallery of confessions. So they've all got something to say. John Coltrane and Alice Coltrane, in fact. So I find it very interesting. If you look back a little further to Ornette Coleman and John Coltrane, you get the seeds of a lot of things, that a lot of the outrageous things they were doing then, maybe in front of smaller audiences. We proggers, as we're now known, ended up taking to much larger audiences, but essentially they were the same ideas, much the same as the Stones taking basic blues ideas to a wider audience. Maybe it's just a case of being younger, and so a new face on the block, or several new faces, might be able to represent the same ideas.
Well, you were in your early 20s, yeah?
Sorry?
You were in your early 20s at that time.
Yeah, early 20s, and we didn't have to deal with segregation and all that shit. So we just got out there. We were British in America. It took a long time for the penny to drop. Audiences just wanted a boogie instead of listening to our musical opuses meets odysseys and all the rest. So people didn't really get it. I think as the production values increased, and as the budget went up in order to allow us to do that, so the audience numbers went up exponentially. So people would like to see a show. It doesn't mean that it's any better music or worse music. It's just, okay, the circus happens to have 20 elephants in it. Fine, I want to go and see that show with 20 elephants, you know, with the dancing girls in the wings and the lasers and all the rest. It was Bill Bruford who was saying, you know, you guys don't take any chances, do you? You know, you've got all this hardware out there and all this expense. And of course, people were interested in seeing a show where I suspect, you know, the complicated aspect of the music wasn't necessarily what brought people in. I don't know. There couldn't have been that many musos interested that would fill arenas listening to that stuff. It helps to have the ability to be able to do a coast-to-coast TV show. And I think when we did the Mike Douglas show, as it was in might have been 77, 76, suddenly, you know, from playing to know people in Dallas, for instance, to, you know, being able to play to 18 or 20,000 was there overnight. It was Shoko, who were based in Dallas, who were doing our sound and lights, but no way could we play the South. We just couldn't do it. But funnily enough, I'm going to be taking a chance of doing the South again myself in a few. Well, actually, I don't know if it'll be this year, maybe next year, but it's kind of coming up. It's in the pipeline. Mad fool that I am. And what kind of country music do you play? None, sir. There you are.
So the album's coming out. Is it going to be a DVD as well of
Yeah, it's a live foxtrot mixed by Chris Lord-Alge, who's done a great job. Yeah, it sounds wonderful. You know, for a live revisit, it sounds great. It's
and
really
the
well
tour
played and mixed.
and the tour is starting in I think kind of auspiciously in Quebec in October, someplace where Genesis landed pretty well, I think, at the beginning. Yes.
Yeah, for some reason, French Canada took us to heart in the early days, and I don't know whether word traveled over from France itself, but France was an early supporting region for us, as well as French-speaking Belgium, of course.
Yeah, I'd like to say thank you, Steve Hackett, for all the music over the years and the inspiration and just the tremendous variety of approaches that you opened our ears to classical and jazz and rock and all sorts of things. And it's really been a pleasure. And
Thank you.
Always great to talk to you, Steve.
I'll try and keep it coming. Still making a noise for a living. Thank you so much, Greg. Thanks,
Okay, see you out there on the road, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Ciao, ciao. Bye.